Well, good morning. I appreciate the chance to speak for a few minutes on the subject, the topic of grief. C.S. Lewis often commented about the novelty of his grief when he lost his wife, Joy, and today I want to speak about the process, the pain, some of the peculiarities of grief, and yet I want to give a lot of attention to the normalcy of it, the fact that it is natural, that it is necessary, as well as the novelty of it. And so, once again, thank you for the chance to speak today. I want to start off with this scenario right here, if I could, and ask you some questions this morning as you're listening. If I ask you this morning about this scenario, what would you say? And I'll give you some questions to kind of follow up with this scenario. If I ask you about a man who, at some point in his life, he lost a friend in a tragic shooting that was covered by national news. Lost a mother to drowning in his brother's pool, lost a brother-in-law to a massive heart attack, lost a career of 20 years to COVID and some other circumstances, lost a best friend or cut ties with a best friend during that time as well, and then also lost his dog to a cancerous tumor, all within a matter of about 20 years. I guess the first question to you would be, which one would be most painful? As you kind of listen to that scenario, just raise your hand if you want to engage and answer that question. Which one would you say, ma'am, would be the most painful to you of those? Probably losing the mother, yeah, and a lot of you would agree with that. Yes, losing your mother, and some of you can imagine losing a mother in such a tragic way, a brother-in-law to a heart attack. Truth is that when you put all of them on a grief continuum, if you will, they all hurt at different time frames on that continuum, and that story is really peculiar to me. That's happened to me over the last 20 years, and if I were honest, the one that is most painful to me now is the loss of the dog, because it's happened most recently. They all seem to kind of pile up and together seem to kind of perplex me and confuse me at times, and yet the most painful one right now, if I were honest, would be the loss of my dog. My wife and I were talking to someone the other day on social media, and she was just talking about how painful the loss of her dog was. And some, when you're listening today, some may say, well, the loss of a dog, the grief of a dog is silly. But it's real. It's not. It's loss nonetheless. And so whether we're talking about a job, spouse, loss of a child, loss of a career path, loss of a friend, loss of a dog, whatever we're talking about is loss. It's grief. It's painful. If I ask you which one of these might take the longest period to grieve through, many of you would probably say the loss of a mother or the loss of a spouse or a child for sure. If I ask you this question, what could make the pain of the loss go away? Really, the only answer that anybody's ever come up with for thousands of years is I just wish that my loved one, my dog, my career, my identity, if you would return. I just wish things would be like they used to be. And so when we're talking about grief, that's really one thing that we need to address is the reality, the painful reality that loved one is not going to return. One thing that occurs sometimes, especially if you put kind of these grief experiences on a continuum, is this understanding and really this question of, since I've experienced the great loss of a spouse, of a child, whatever it was, whatever that first really traumatic, painful loss was, there's really this anticipatory thing that starts to occur. It's kind of the phrase that we use, waiting for the next shoe to fall. When's the next thing, the bad thing, going to happen? It's kind of a thought that if you go back to the early 1900s, I believe this is where this saying came from, out of New York City. People would sit in their apartments and they'd be lying in bed at night and they'd be listening to their neighbors above them, and they kind of imagine their neighbors kind of in this bunk bed situation, if you would, and the shoes would come off the bed and they would hit the floor, and the person beneath them in that that apartment complex would just lie there awake at night, waiting for the next shoe to fall. And kind of that kind of summarizes, if you would, the experience of grief for some is the painful thought that the thing that I dreaded occurred, the fear that I feared took place. And so when you're talking about grief, you're not just talking about a single individual traumatic experience. You're talking about both working through that or failing to work through that situation, and then anticipating the next one and the next one and the next one, because really loss in our stomachs never really goes away. It stays with us. As a matter of fact, the next one re-aggravates the first one and the previous one, right? So that's kind of the thinking in grief. Let me give you a definition of grief, if we could, this morning. This is kind of a combination of multiple definitions that I put together that is not mine, but like I said, a combination of many definitions. Grief is a deep, wrenching sorrow of loss, initially intense, anguish, powerful, multifaceted, and often uncontrollable response to loss of human beings, identity, jobs, pets. It is, and specifically, often it is uniquely challenging because of the suddenness of that loss. I want to stress that this morning: the suddenness of a death, the suddenness of a divorce, the suddenness of a romantic or platonic relationship changing, the suddenness of a career path changing, a robbery, a burglary, an assault. We were speaking to a family this past week, my wife and I were, about a couple who had lost their house in a fire, and the suddenness and yet the depth of their grief, because a fire literally consumes everything, right? And it's a reboot, it's a restart, it's looking back at what we once had, but being forced to begin again. And that's part of this grief process that we're talking about today. C.S. Lewis called it an amputation, if you will. Amputation is a good word for the loss of a loved one, or a career, or identity, or community, if you would. It's the want for an arm or a leg that used to be there. When I had rotator cuff surgery a number of years ago, they did a nerve block on me, and I knew, or at least I thought I knew, that my right arm was still there. It was blocked from me acknowledging I couldn't touch it, I couldn't feel it. I sort of knew that it was there, but then I kind of questioned whether it was, and I was disoriented and confused. And that's kind of a summation statement of grief, in the sense that that we're disoriented and we're confused and frustrated and feelings of that that we think is there or once was there, and now we're confused if it is there anymore. And so an amputation, if you will, is kind of a good kind of illustration of what grief feels like. I wrote this, and I think this is good language for us. If you haven't experienced grief, you will. It's universal and individual. It is both personal and a respecter of no persons. It's both nullifying and clarifying. It's the height of pain, and it's the depth of numbness. It is measured by seconds and seasons. It's measured by hours and years. It's measured by both a level of happiness once known up against a level of joylessness that is now known. Part of grief is the shadow of it, the suffering of it, the perpetual thinking of it. C.S. Lewis said that he not only lived each day in grief, but he lived each day thinking about living in grief. Someone said grief is kind of like that toothache. You're sitting in the dentist chair. It's kind of like that toothache, and you really don't know how to grab and grapple the grief. And some people, C.S. Lewis said, some people just put their hands in their lap and they'll just kind of take and absorb the work that the dentist is doing. And then some will hold on to the dentist chair and just latch on as tightly as they can. And in either account, it's just a toothache, because the drilling that the dentist does, it goes on and on and on and on. It just doesn't seem to stop. Loss or death and the emotions of it occur in time, and they occur on a timeline, but they don't neatly surface on a timeline so that we can address them, so that they can deal with them. Often dealing with grief and the emotions and loss, they surface at times that really catch us off guard, or they're unwanted, or it's just not a good time for me to start crying about these things. But that's what grief is sometimes in terms of our dealing with it. It catches us off guard, and it catches us at times that we don't want it to. We wouldn't suspect that it would. These feelings, we don't deal with them linearly. They rise up and then they fade. They occur and reoccur and then they fade. And then they're often sometimes confusingly followed by times of joy and happiness and normalcy. Grief can go round and round. It can give the appearance that we're going in circles. And someone said even on a downward spiral, if you will. And we ask questions: how often will this be? Am I always going to feel this way? C.S. Lewis wrote, "How often will the vast emptiness astonish me like a complete novelty and make me say, I never realized my loss until this moment." And when I said earlier that grief and healthy grief is normal and natural and necessary, and yet there's this novelty about it. When it continues to surface, it occurs and reoccurs and then fades and then occurs again. And when it occurs again, it strikes us as this novelty, like, wow, I didn't know that this was going to happen again. But that's the confusion and perplexity sometimes, complexity, if you will, of grief. So healthy grief, as we've said, is perfectly natural and necessary and normal, and even has a novelty about it. These are all kind of normal things that happen physiologically, psychologically, emotionally in grief. Lots of tears and crying and sobbing. Sleep patterns tend to change. Difficulty of falling asleep or not getting quite enough or getting too much sleep. An overall lack of energy, feeling lethargic, apathetic, changes in appetite, eating too much, not eating enough, particularly liking junk food, withdrawing, having difficulty concentrating, and questioning everything are effects mentally that take place, in addition to somewhat of a loneliness, depression, emptiness, sadness. The effects on the body can be inflammation, can be infection, can be an immune system that's compromised, can be increased blood pressure, possible clots, even what some call the broken heart syndrome. Literally, our heart, when we've had traumatic loss, it feels like our heart is breaking, and really we are exhibiting symptomatic things that are occurring in our body that feel like a heart attack. This broken heart syndrome. Now, complicated grief is somewhat differentiated and distinguished between healthy grief. A complicated grief, or what some call abnormal or chronic grief, is different in terms of intensity and in terms of frequency. Complicated grief does not fade over time, or doesn't seem like it's fading over time. It impairs or prevents people from leading normal lives. The episodes of anger and rage, they just continue to rage on. There's a perpetual inability to focus. There's a focus that intensely reminds us of the person who's deceased, or there's an intensity to avoid any thoughts or feelings of that deceased person. And so you can see how complicated grief takes us to the extremes and doesn't let us deal with grief kind of in the middle, if you will. There seems to be a real intense sadness and detachment and hopelessness and emptiness, self-destructive behaviors such as alcohol and drug abuse, suicidal thoughts, a struggle. This is how I would differentiate complicated grief from kind of a normal grief. A real deep, penetrating struggle with self-esteem and self-blame and self-worth. This feeling, and it's an elongated kind of perpetual season of I'm trapped and I can't get out. I'm in a rabbit hole and I don't know how to get out of this rabbit hole. And I would say to you today, if that's where you are, it's been 6 months, it's been a year, it's been 18 months, and you've exhibited some of these complicated grief symptoms, I would suggest that you get some help. You can just 3, 4, 5 of those things. I would go, yeah, it's probably time that I get some help. So. certainly do that. Don't feel afraid or frightened or fearful of that. There's really no specific time frame that we would call, that we would say that grief kind of lands on, or there's no threshold. Some would say that the threshold should be somewhere around 6 months to a year. We start to kind of grapple with the reality, the acceptance of the loss of a loved one. And yet the truth is that and once again, I really want to kind of emphasize the normalcy and the naturalness of this. We're going to continue to deal with grief, especially around birthdays, around anniversaries, around Thanksgiving. This Thanksgiving is about to come up next month, and in December, Christmas, and certain things, Valentine's Day, birthdays, anniversaries, all of those things are going to cause these emotions to rise up in us again, and that is very normal and natural. And so we need to understand that while we would like to be able to put grief on a timeline and define it and be able to say, okay, at 6 months I'm going to do this, at a year I'm going to do this, that's probably not going to occur. My mother has passed away now 10 or 11 years, and I still struggle with May 8th, and I still struggle with Mother's Day, and I still struggle with celebrations around Thanksgiving table. I just do. And I think that's normal, and some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Let me say something about the demographics of grief a little bit. Women are more vulnerable to complicated grief, especially than men. Women, on average, are more likely to be ruminators or fixators on loss in grief and dealing and struggling with the significant loss of someone in their life. And I would say, once again, that just is probably normal because women in general are just better at relationships with men. They tend to dive deeper and dig deeper into relationships and put more and invest more into relationships as mothers, as sisters, as friends. And so we can imagine that would complicate their grief all the more in terms of the greater loss that they experience, the greater energy it's going to take to grieve and work through and process the loss of a loved one. Researchers estimate that complicated grief affects about 2 to 3% of the population worldwide. So I've addressed normal grief and complicated grief, and only about 2 to 3% of people who've lost a significant other experience what they call complicated grief. It affects, and once again, complicated grief is what I'm talking about here. It affects about 10 to 20% of people who have lost a spouse or a child specifically, suddenly, violently. About 10 to 20% will have some resemblance of complicated grief at some point as it relates to the death of a spouse or a child. Conventional wisdom in the past concerning grief, especially coming from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, really framed grief in 5 different categories, if you will: denial and anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance. And while some of this has been helpful in the past, it's really an axiom of grief counseling today. That is, grief, and this is a quote from Kubler-Ross, grief tends to be a little bit more individual and personal and singular. It doesn't necessarily fit into these 5 stages, although there are aspects of each one of these stages that are helpful in terms of acceptance, the last stage, or bargaining, or even denial, the beginning stage, where we're even struggling with the reality that this person has gone. We just cannot accept that. And so there are certain parts of it that remain true, and yet the overall 5 stages of grief have been slowly, over the course of the last couple of decades, kind of been put to the side in regard to grief being kind of a singular individual experience. There is some good stuff, some new stuff out there. I found this very interesting, that grief can really show itself in kind of in regard to the way it presents itself. It really presents itself in some ways like a traumatic brain injury would. And if you've done any reading on traumatic brain injuries, you know how the brain just seems to stop functioning, and certain things such as they become forgetful, or they lose names in mid conversation. They're on the phone to get ready to talk to somebody and they can't remember who they called. Stuff like that is kind of you see that in traumatic brain injury, and then you see it in those that are struggling with the grief process. And the problem is not necessarily the deep sorrow and the inability to function and all of that. The problem is really what grief does in terms of the fog and the confusion and the disorientation, and even sometimes delusions of magical thinking. I was reading an article by Dr. Lisa Schulman. She was a neurologist, or is a neurologist, at the University of Maryland, and she lost her husband to an aggressive cancer a number of years ago. And she described this grief process of hers in a kind of traumatic brain injury kind of category, when she said, I would wake up to an unfamiliar world where all of the rules were scrambled. On several occasions after her husband's death, she would lose track of time, she would run an errand, and she would find herself in an unfamiliar place and unsure of where she was, and she would have to use the GPS on her phone to figure out how to get back home. And some of y'all are saying, I might have a traumatic brain injury. Well, that's not really what I'm saying. I'm just saying this is kind of indicative of trying to draw a parallel between some of the symptoms of traumatic brain injury and then some of the effects that grief can have on us in terms of the brain. And yet there's some good news out there. One of the things that happens, it looks like, when we're going through this grief process is something called neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is basically the brain rewiring itself. It rewires itself in terms of connections that need to be made in the complications of the loss. So it kind of, the brain is an unbelievable instrument in helping us grieve and really work through and reconstruct life. But neuroplasticity shows us that it kind of works back in terms of addressing the needs that the person has in terms of kind of fashioning and forging thoughts and grappling with the grief process. And in the same way, neuroplasticity shows us that the brain is able to go forward, and the neurons and the nerves, if you will, of the brain, they're able to kind of recreate and reconfigure so that the brain really does assist in helping with traumatic loss. So there's a backwards movement. There's a malleability that the brain shows us goes backwards in terms of addressing the complications of grief, but also moves forward in terms of helping that person restore and move towards healthiness. And I just thought that was a really important feature in grief in terms of telling you grief is natural, and it's normal, and it's necessary, and it even has a novelty. And there are parts of your body, and specifically your mind, that are helping you get through this thing that feels so unnatural to you. Yeah. Okay. So many in the pandemic are dealing with grief in ways that are unprecedented, in ways that we've never ever seen. The inability to go to hospitals, to have funerals, to have gravesides, to gather and to celebrate, to mourn the death. To mourn, if you have a church family, it's been 16, 18 months since you've been able to go to a funeral, and especially if you're from an older congregation, you've lost these friends who you may or may not have seen in your congregation for the last however many months, and you haven't even been able to, until recently been able to have funerals and gravesides. And so there might be multiple people that you lost in the pandemic, and if they were close to you, you've yet to begun that grieving process as individuals, as a church, and this can really stifle and present issues in terms of us grieving normally and naturally. And so I was thinking about, I've spoken with grandparents and aunts and uncles and families that are desiring to see this. We have a couple in our family who just had a young baby about 3 months ago, and there was a period of time where just a very limited amount of people could see the baby. And a couple weeks ago, we got to see this baby boy Bentley in our church, and everybody was really excited. And yet there was a 2.5 month period where nobody could see the child just because of the pandemic. And And when we think about a newborn coming into this new family and how exciting that is, I think about the other side of that and how we've lost folks, loved ones, and people that we've known for years and years and years, and we haven't been able to come together and grieve and sing and even celebrate this person's life, and that process has been put on hold, and what a challenge that has been in the pandemic. Yeah, for sure. So addressing complicated grief. I was reading something that I thought was really, really good, and I'll give you this language. It's called Situational Revisiting, and Situational Revisiting is really just, it's a form of providing people an opportunity to confront the reality of their loss, and basically it's grief work that has begun in terms of presenting the person who's in need of grief therapy, presenting photos and memories and texts and stories and posts and really bringing it together in a specific, strategic, intentional kind of time frame in counseling for a prolonged period of time, bringing together this person. It's almost like you're repainting, recreating this composite picture of this person that you've lost. You've been unable to even begin the process, and so you slowly introduce aspects of the past to kind of recreate and reconfigure this composite of this person, this relationship, this loved one that you have. And this situational revisiting is something that really addresses. I think it addresses two things. It addresses the opportunity for the person to begin to move forward. They've accepted what has happened in the past, and they've kind of recreated and are beginning to remember and be reinvigorated by the life and what occurred in this relationship with this person. But also what's interesting is really this part of it is that it addresses intentionally the choice that we sometimes as individuals make to avoid that altogether. There's a real powerful component of grief in terms of avoiding it and just not wanting to address it, not wanting to deal with it. And I told you earlier when one of the most painful things that's happened to me in the last 20 years is losing our dog Rose. And in some ways, I don't. If I were honest with myself, I probably have not begun the grieving process, or have not taken steps that I should have. And yet a couple of weeks ago, I just decided it was time. And so the animal hospital that served us so faithfully and so well here in Scott-Swainsboro, I began driving by that, and where initially I would turn left before I even got there. I didn't even want to see the animal hospital. Now I've begun driving by and seeing people walk in and walk out, and how that hospital is serving this community and serving them well with pets, cats, dogs that are sick, and whatever the situation might be, and just kind of beginning to let my brain rewire itself, and thankful for the way that they were able to serve us when we had Rose here, and thankful that the way that they're able to serve people now, whether it's in the loss of a pet, or whether they're helping keep the pet healthy, whatever it is. So my brain is kind of reconfiguring and rethinking and working through this grief process in a different way that I think and I hope is healthy, right? So grief work is work. If relationship building was work, then grieving and loss will be work. Rebuilding, restoring after loss will be work. Going places, doing things intentionally, writing thoughts, talking through, all of this strategic healing is work. Forging an identity in this world without the one that you once loved is work. I used to tell my girls all of the time, and I've added a third component to this recently. I used to say to them when I would drop them off at middle school, I used to say, if you know who you are, then you know what to do. And now I've added a third component. Because knowing who you are, this new identity in this new world without your loved one that you've lost is important. So knowing who you are is important. Knowing what you should do without the loved one that you had is important. But also knowing your why. Why am I doing this? I'm making a decision. I know who I am. I know what I'm supposed to do. And that why is really, really an important component in terms of forging this new identity. Part of losing someone very close is that we lose our sense of identity. When we lose mama, there's part of a sonship that is lost. When we lose daddy, there's part of a daughtership that is lost. When we lose a spouse, there's a half of a marriage that is lost, or maybe a whole marriage. And so an identity has to be forged and reconfigured, if you will. So if part of losing someone is a sense of our loss of identity, then part of grieving is regaining it, albeit a new one. And starting seems to be most challenging. I want to say this morning, and this is for some of you who have found yourself to be who found yourself to be on the other end of the grieving process. You've been the listener, you've been the mouthpiece, you've been the counsel, you've been the mirror, you've been the one that people have just talked to, and just you've been available, if you will. I must say that I've spent most of my life on the other end of that counseling session. I've been the mouth or the ear. I've not been the brokenhearted. I've not been the scattered mind. And I want to say to you this morning that number one, thank you for that. Thank you for being a listening ear and a grieving heart and someone who really does care about the brokenhearted. What a great compassionate gesture and characteristic that is of yours. But I want to tell you this: just because you've been that doesn't mean that you are, because of whether you're trained professionally or whether you're just experienced, doesn't mean that you can go through this grieving process alone, because you have grieved with others and you know how, you know what they want to hear or what they would have felt. And so this self-talk is not going to be helpful to you. You're going to need somebody to be your listening ears, to be a compassionate mouth, to be somebody that you can bounce things off of. And I think that's one of the mistakes that I made when I began some of the grieving that I've done, is that I thought I could handle it by myself, and I couldn't. I want to say 4 things this morning that you need to be aware of, and then I'll close here. First of all, understand this, is that when we're grieving, although it's normal and natural and necessary, and it feels like a novelty each time it just kind of summons itself up inside of us, I want to say that, number one, beware of this anger that might be amped up inside of you. Particularly loss of a spouse, of a child, of these really traumatic, painful experiences. Be aware of your frustration. Be aware of the fog and the confusion that is bringing about frustration in you, and underneath this thing that presents itself as anger is definitively a frustration, a hurt, a deep abiding sadness. So beware, number one, that your anger can be amped up. Beware in terms of blaming yourself, blaming others, and blaming God. Be aware of that tendency, because that's very normal to do, that your anger might be amped up. Second, I'll get kind of personal here with this. When I lost my mother, my wife Daphne gave me a gift of what I called inarticulative groaning. And what I mean by that is that I didn't have anything to say in the evenings when we had lied in bed at night. I just was unable to really articulate what was going on with me. I did a lot of groaning and moaning, and she held my hand and she rubbed my chest and she cried tears with me that I didn't understand then, but I understand now. It was a gift that she gave me of hearing my inarticulative groans. And there will be a time, I've sat with many people in the last 25 or 30 years. I've sat with a man who drank too much alcohol one afternoon after a Jacksonville Jaguars football game, and got in a car with his 7-year-old boy and drove himself into a car accident and killed himself. I've met with that man. I've met with a girl who was raped 25 years ago repeatedly over and over and over again by a friend of the family. And I sat with her and I listened to her for a solid hour one night, and all she could say was, I can't believe I'm getting ready to say this out loud. She couldn't speak. She couldn't speak the truth of the loss and the pain and the hurt. And really what that was it was just an inability. It was just a groaning. It was just an utterance that didn't make sense. It made all the sense in the world in terms of the confusion and all the stuff that needed to come out, and she knew it. But all I was for her was just a listening ear at the time. And so you may need somebody in your life who can listen to your inarticulation, your groans. Third, activity. If you're grieving, keep up your activities. Get back into your habits, your disciplines, your routines. If you don't have any, begin new ones. Isolation is not your friend. Complacency, indifference, ambivalence, and all these things is not your friend. So activity and routines and disciplines and habits are really, really good for working out some of this bottled up whatever it is inside of us. And fourth, acceptance. Living in a world in which the loved one is lost. You need to hear me say that living in this new world is not betrayal. It may feel like betrayal, but it's not betrayal. Living in this new world is just beginning again. It's learning to live again. There's a big difference between betraying the one that we've lost and just beginning again as we need to and as we have to. I'll conclude with this quote, and then I'll say thank you for having me today. Someone said, "We were promised sufferings. We came into the world screaming, and we weren't real happy with it as babies. And in some ways, this will continue. Grief and loss are just a part of the program. Somewhere we are told, happy are they that mourn, for they will be comforted. And I, you, we that grieve must accept both. We must accept loss and mourning, and we must accept the reality of working to find comfort. We must deal with and address the grief that we must face in this life, understanding that the gift of life both brings about grief, but also can bring about health in grief. Thank you.